very negative about Korean public enterprise. They make deficit. A loss has become a burden to the country. But now, by observing the substantial amounts of profit generated by the public enterprise, the public opinion appear in newspapers say, Korean public enterprise make too much profit.
That is interesting. I think I would like to leave at this happy note that that one can also get blamed for being very lucky and doing well. I certainly hope we are not in that situation. Well, I would love to continue. I would have wanted to continue with this discussion. It's fascinating, but unfortunately I have an MOU with my producer over here and the TV crew, and they would simply not let me go. I will be judged by how well I keep my commitment with them. So with that, I thank you all for being with us this evening. It was short but extremely fruitful. I can say that we were very efficient and highly productive. And with that, thank you very much for watching us.
Lake in the world, the highest capital in the world, the highest golf course in the world, the highest ski slopes in the world. On the other hand, it has the lowest inflation rate in Latin America. In terms of topography and natural beauty, La Paz is absolutely unique. But in the sphere of public policy towards its public enterprises, Bolivia has a lot in common with the rest of the world. Like all over the developing world, Bolivia is striving to improve the performance of its public enterprises. And like many other countries, it is using performance contracts to do the same. I got distracted. Okay, let's do it one more time. Sorry. This is La Paz, Bolivia. Bolivia is a country of superlatives. It has the highest lake in the world, the highest capital in the world, the highest golf course in the world, the highest ski slopes in the world. On the other hand, it has the lowest inflation rate in Latin America. In terms of topography and natural beauty, La Paz is absolutely unique. But in the sphere of public policy toward its public enterprises, Bolivia has a lot in common with the rest of the world. Like all over the developing world, Bolivia is striving to improve the performance of its public enterprises. And like many countries, it is using performance contracts to do so. Let me start by introducing the qualified panel that we have this evening with us. On my right is Mr. Edgar Saravia, who was in charge of this policy some time back. Then we have Mr. Gerardo. Then we have with us Mr. Gerardo Tehrina, who is in charge of this policy at this moment in Bolivia. And on my far right is Mr. Javier Burgos, who has been associated with this policy right from its inception. So as you can see, it is difficult to find a more qualified panel than this in Bolivia. And so let's get down to the issues immediately. Okay. Let me start this conversation by asking Edgar the first question, and the question which is on the minds of everyone, that is, how did this policy start in Bolivia? What were its objectives and what were its origin? Let me just give it to you.
Thank you very much, Praja. Basically, the origins of this policy in Bolivia go back to the previous government in August of 1985. After successfully stabilizing the economy through a combination of an open market economy together with fiscal discipline, they had found that something was lacking, and that was basically that public enterprises were not necessarily following the discipline that the central government was following. Therefore, there was a need to complete this process to introduce some sort of control for public enterprises. Two things were sought. First of all, to control public enterprises, and as a second step, to study ways in which efficiency in the public enterprise sector.
Let me, because it's good, right? Let me start by asking Edgar first, a question which is on the minds of everybody who's going to be watching this program. That is, how did this policy start? What were its origins and what were its objectives? Edgar.
Thank you very much, Praja. This policy got started with the previous government in 1985 as a complement to the stabilization policy started by that government. That program had as objectives to bring down hyperinflation, and this was largely achieved through a series of reforms which included fiscal discipline. After 2 years of successfully achieving this discipline, it was found that there was a loophole, and that was basically that public enterprises were not necessarily following that discipline. The objectives then became to try to find ways in which to control public enterprises and make sure that they were following the same fiscal discipline as the central government on the one hand, and once that was achieved, to look for ways in which public enterprises' efficiency could be improved. The program got started through the formulation of a project that was requested to the IDB. This was finally, the request was made originally in February of 1988. Funds were approved in July of 1989. So the project actually got started in July of 1989 and had precisely those two objectives. First of all, to see and search for ways to control public enterprises, and second, to try to find ways in which to evaluate public enterprises and thus be able to improve on their performance.
Before we go any further, Edgar, could you briefly describe to us what exactly is this contratos de rendimiento, as you call it here in Bolivia, the essential features of that, and then we can move further.
Right. The contratos de rendimiento, or performance contracts here in Bolivia, are similar to a lot of performance contracts in other developing countries. Basically, the main features are as follows. Through a series of obligations that the parties take, on the one hand the government as owner of the enterprise, and on the other hand the management of the company as the manager, you try to define the general rules of the game. Next, you try to find for every individual enterprise a set of indicators that will best measure performance of that company. Then, having done that, you try to define specific goals for those indicators, You define also at the very beginning, at the time the contract is being negotiated and signed, define the relative weights of each one of the goals, the system for evaluating so that there is no ambiguity as to what is meant for good performance for the enterprise. And then finally, you have a system of incentives and sanctions. Incentives are normally awarded once performance exceeds the goals that were established by the enterprise, and that takes the form in Bolivia. It's an economic incentive, and on the other hand, if performance is not met, there are a series of sanctions which could go as far as removing the manager from his position. That is basically what the main features of performance contracts or contratos de rendimiento are in Bolivia.
Thank you. Edgar, before I move on to others, let me just ask you a quick question, which is, how has this policy progressed over the years, since its inception?
Since its inception in really July of 1990, because the project gets started in July of 1989, and it takes basically 7 to 8 months to study different alternatives for controlling and improving performance of public enterprises. Since its inception, we have managed to sign 2 short-term pilot contracts, each one with a duration of 6 months. One contract was signed with ENDE, which is the electric generating company, and another contract was signed with ENFE, which is the railway company. After that, after successfully signing and evaluating those contracts at the end of 1990, during 1991, a series of other contracts were negotiated, and 3 or 4 additional contracts were signed. But I believe that perhaps the latest achievements could best be explained by Gerardo, who is obviously in charge now.
Absolutely, and I think you're absolutely right, and that's exactly what we want to do, to just find out what is the current status of the policy, and especially, since the last few days that I've been here in Bolivia, I've been watching the newspapers. They're full of headlines about privatization, so it would be interesting for you to for us to know exactly what is the current status of the policy of performance contracts and how does it relate to the policy of privatization. What's the current thinking here? Thank you.
Thank you, Praja. Well, as Edgar was saying, until now we have signed 7 contratos de rendimiento, these performance contracts. But of course, the number of contracts doesn't mean anything about the quality of them. And I think that in the near future we'll be signing a number around 5 or 4 more performance contracts, and that be all, because as was mentioned today, the public sector, the public enterprise sector, which are we focusing in, is responsible for about 90% of the whole transaction in the sector. So we think that we are focusing on the main enterprises. About the policy for the future and what is the actual policy for these performance contracts, as you said, Praja, we are trying to make some more efforts towards privatization. Of course, we have to do it in a case-by-case basis. And we also have constraints in our constitution for transferring parts of some of the enterprises. For example, the one who is working on hydrocarbons and the mines. What is it? What is the linkage between performance contracts and privatization? What we are intending to do is to have to create some scenarios in which we're going to have to cut.
I mean,
as everywhere else in this part of the world, and indeed in the third world, privatization is, of course, another kind of solution for some common problems. And as I said, in the case-by-case basis, we were trying to either privatize directly the enterprise or sign these performance contracts, but taking some actions towards privatization, like, for example, designing a strategic plan for the sector, which includes more private sector participation. And of course, this means in these sectors where some of the enterprises are acting as monopolies, well, we have to work in the deregulation scheme. That is one part. Of course, we don't want the people to see that these two policies are substitutes. We want to see it, and we see it as complementary policies. Well, that is
very well. Could you also, before we move on, could we discuss some of the achievements of the performance contracts and what have been the achievements? And then I'll also like to ask Edgar, because Edgar was also involved with this policy. What have been some of the achievements of the policy, of the contratos de rendimiento, in the time that you have been in the office?
Well, until now we have made, as Edgar said, we evaluated only 2 enterprises at the end of 1990, and right now we are making monitoring only, not evaluating yet the other 5, and of course plus the second mention, the 2 of mentioned enterprises. But still, we can talk about an improvement of the enterprises in some specific areas, like, for example, in designing some systems, cost systems, designing information systems, and of course we think that this will improve the performance at all. Our monitoring work tells us that things are going in a good direction, and we really are expecting much more than we expected for this year. In terms of results, we can only talk about the 2 enterprises that mentioned Edgar, in which I think one of the most important things that we have achieved right now is, of course, improving the management of these enterprises, but also that the government is now he really knows about the problems that are facing these enterprises, and is considering various solutions. And of course, this means that the government is adopting, is getting more acknowledgement of the kinds of the problems that this enterprise is facing. And of course, I think that this is another very important point for us, because it was a chronic problem in the past years that the governments didn't know what happened with their enterprises, and of course didn't know what to do with this, how to deal with these problems. So I can point at these results, the both of these sides, an improvement on the performance and an improvement on the acknowledgement of these enterprises by the government.
Before we move on to Javier, may I take this on to Javier? What I'd like to do is ask the same question to Edgar and see if you have anything to add on to what Gerardo has said.
Yes, thank you. Just picking up on the last thing that Gerardo said, I think it's very important to recognize that the contracts, just the fact that a contract is negotiated and signed is an improvement. It's a big improvement in that it helps to define very clearly what the enterprise is responsible for and what the government's responsible for. Until recent times, what happened here was what happened with public enterprises all over the world, especially the developing world, that nobody really could pinpoint the reasons for the negative results. Were they because of wrong policies on the side of the government? Were they because of poor management on the side of the company? By defining very clearly responsibilities, we are moving some steps forward towards being able to identify it on the basis of the results who is responsible for that. So I think that is important. The other thing that I would also like to point out as a positive result of this is that in the two companies that have been evaluated that Gerardo mentioned, that is the electricity company and the railway company, not only has there been an improvement in the indicators, in the quantitative indicators which can be measured, but what's perhaps more important, there has been a change in the attitude of management, not only top management but also middle management, to the point where everybody in the company now feels responsible towards the achievement of the goals and feels that he not only has to do his job, but he has to do it within certain constraints. And I think that is a very positive thing, a very positive result.
Thank you. Now, we've heard a lot about the general features of the Bolivian system. And obviously, people who are familiar with other systems wonder how exactly it is different. I mean, obviously, each country has its own nuances, their own idiosyncrasies, and they can't have the same system cannot be replicated in any country, and that would be a mistake to do. And I think that is the case in Bolivia. Bolivia has a unique performance contract system, which is suitable for Bolivia. To understand some of those nuances, some of those differences, how is it different from other systems? If I may ask Javier, who knows a lot about other systems, and in particular about the Indian system of the Memorandum of Understanding. Javier, could you tell us in brief what are the main differences between the Bolivian system of contratos de rendimiento and the Indian system of Memorandum of Understanding?
Okay, Praja, you know, this is a hard question. It's very hard to say in a few minutes what are the real differences between two kind of performance contracts. In this case, we're going to talk about MOUs in India, in contratos de rendimiento here in Bolivia. I hope that you know that in Bolivia we speak Spanish and my English is not a fluent one. I hope that you can understand me. Well, I want to start saying that I want to take the differences in four broad categories. One is general features. The second one is the information system. The third one is the evaluation system. And the last one, I think it's the incentives and sanctions system. Okay, the first category, what I want to talk is about, as I said a few minutes ago, in the general topics. The first thing, I think it's the number of public enterprises. In India, Raja, you have, I don't know, I'm not sure, but I think more or less 1,500 public enterprises, taking the regional enterprises too. Here in Bolivia, we have more or less 160 public enterprises. This year, or maybe in 1992, government has to sell, wants to sell, it's better, more or less 39% of the whole public enterprises. But these numbers don't mean nothing when we're talking about the turnover of the public enterprises. I think that in India, like in Bolivia, MOUs and contratos de rendimiento takes more or less 85% of the total turnover of the public enterprises. This is an important fact. Secondly, I have to say that we are starting, as Edgar and Gerardo say before, in fact, our first performance contract, our first contrato de rendimiento start in the middle of 1990. In India, the system began in 1986, I think so. What else can I say? Yeah, there's an important topic. In India, you have the MMC, the MOU monitoring cell, which follows the whole MOUs when they are running. Here in Bolivia, we have a División de Contratos de Rendimiento, which belongs to the Ministry of Planning, which is the unit has do the following to the Contratos de Rendimiento. I'm not sure that I take the important topics, the most important topics in this broad category. But I want to go to the second category, which is the information system. In India, I'm really sure that the public enterprise performance information system, which is called PEPIS, is running very well since a few years ago. Here in Bolivia, we're just born in the system. We have the data for the whole enterprises which are signed performance contracts, but we don't have this data together like a database in which we can do some kind of analysis. We have only individual data, and this is only, as I said, the begin. We are just beginning with the system. I hope if the next year we have any chance to talk again, I can say you that we're running with a better and stronger system of information. I think because we're just beginning, there's no more to say in this category. In the first category, we're putting the evaluation system. The evaluation system has a slight difference between MOUs in India and contratos de rendimiento in Bolivia. One of the facts is that in Bolivia we only evaluate at the moment static indicators, static target. We are only looking for 1 year period in the targets. In India, I think you evaluate also dynamic indicators, which are, I don't know, maybe training